Is Walter White still out there?
No, he's not.
You sound very sure.
I am. I can't speak to this Heisenberg that people refer to. But whatever he became, the sweet, kind, brilliant man that we once knew long ago, he's gone.
But to be absent.
Among the most common sources of discussion when it comes to Breaking Bad is the topic of when Heisenberg took over Walter White. People tend to cite Walt poisoning Brock, or choosing not to save Jane's life, or the stay out of my territory scene, or the Tuco confrontation, or even in some cases as far back as him killing Domingo or merely learning about his diagnosis as the quote-unquote moment where Walter White stopped being the scared, submissive, and bitter but model family man and started being the unrelenting kingpin. And the variety when it comes to people's perceptions of when Heisenberg overtook Walt is understandable given how careful and gradual the evolution is. Personally, I think that you can argue a large number of those moments as being the moment, if that's a discussion that you're interested in. But something that I find strange about those topics is that often, though not always of course, the complexion of that debate revolves around the idea that Walter White and Heisenberg are two fundamentally different people. That there is a moment where Walter White became no more and Heisenberg was all that was left. And while I don't 100% disagree with that sentiment, for me it only works on the basis of the idea that Heisenberg represents the power-hungry, darker side of Walt's personality and not a completely different personality. Though certainly not in a situation where Walter White became no more. Because in my opinion, the original Walter White never disappeared throughout the entirety of the story, and the idea that Heisenberg is a separate entity is fundamentally flawed. Heisenberg is the reaction, the response to a death sentence and the subsequent grasp of power and call to action to start living his life in what he views as the proper way. He wouldn't have started acting this way if he didn't hold that ambition in the first place, and he wouldn't have continued to act that way if he wasn't feeding the ego that had been starving for ages. From the very beginning, Walt was full of ambition. It was only when life began taking its toll that he withered into this husk, but the key components of Heisenberg were there years and years before that cancer diagnosis.
Why buy a starter house when we'll have to move out in a year or two?
Did you win the lottery and not tell me?
I'm serious. Come on. Why be cautious? We've got nowhere to go but up.
In searching for the ideal house for their family, Walt shows enormous confidence and ambition, viewing the place that ended up being their home for more than 16 years as a starter house. Them growing to accept the house as their long-term one is an indicator of Walt possibly growing to love it, but it's also symbolic of his ambition being overburdened by reality. Here he's bright, idealistic, enthusiastic, and hopeful about the future. A far cry from what we see of him later on, in a time before he was burned and found himself dwindling into a run-down life that he never felt in control of. It's pretty sad to see the contrast. He didn't want to settle, and he didn't initially like this house because, in different words, he viewed it as a half measure. And yet, he went with it. As such, this house can be viewed as a representation of a life that never really fulfilled him or gave him holistic joy. But a shift in mentality can be such an enabler. After he learns about his cancer, he starts choosing full measures, completely in control of who he is. And though he occasionally despairs at the person he's turning into, he actively makes very Walter White-esque decisions to suit his Walter White-esque needs every step of the way as he fills the shoes of Heisenberg. They are not decisions that he would have made before, but that does not mean that they aren't decisions that he wouldn't have made at all.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was really I was alive.
While Walter was feeble, Heisenberg is strong. Walter would stumble, run away, and lose heart, and Heisenberg is decisive. Walter had no control over anything, and Heisenberg embodies control. And Walter describes himself as trapped, while Heisenberg is liberated. Nearly everything Heisenberg is the exact opposite of Walter White pre-diagnosis, with the core similarity being that key desire to have power and prove himself. The main difference between them is that Walter never reached out and grabbed any opportunity to take control of his life, while Heisenberg is a Walter White hooked on authority and control. And with the two being so diametrically opposite, how can one not say that they are the same person? I realize that may seem like a strange thing for me to say, but in this case, that contrast is very telling. Oftentimes, people find themselves too scared to become the person they really want to be. But given the stimulus, human beings will often act in the way they desire if they're able, and fulfill dreams they always wanted to fulfill. And those dreams can very often manifest in ways that seem to contradict our current position in one way or another. We are often one step away from becoming very different people, whether that be a good or a bad thing. And all it takes sometimes is to abandon that hesitation and leap forward.
I have spent my whole life scared, frightened of things that could happen, might not happen. 50 years I spent like that. Finding myself awake at 3 in the morning. But you know what? Ever since my diagnosis, I sleep just fine. I came to realize it's that fear that's the worst of it. That's the real enemy.
As I discussed in my previous video about the infamous I am the one who knocks speech where I touched on the same idea, throughout the series he's always had that ambition. He was always petty and always wanted to prove himself. He does at the beginning and he still does very close to the end. The reason that Heisenberg continues to go full throttle past the point of no return is not because of the absence of Walter White within him. It is because of the presence of Walter White within him. Walt and Heisenberg are built upon the same foundation. They act very differently, but they are indistinguishable in terms of identity and formed from the same motives and ideals. Of course, the sociopathic and dark side of Heisenberg is very different from what those who knew Walt had come to expect, and that aspect of him did completely change. But that prideful core, that part of himself that only he was really aware of at first, gave rise to both a trapped, scared, and submissive man resentful of the fact that he couldn't take control who only came to fester even more pride as a result, and a dominant, fearful, and insatiable drug lord consistently gratified yet unsatisfied with his ramping success. Heisenberg is essentially the symbolic persona of a Walter White who has taken control and is living out his power fantasy to sort of make up and compensate for the doldrums of his former life. And I think that the idea that he just faded away and ceased to exist is a pretty big misinterpretation of exactly who and what this monster really is. He's a manifestation of all of the pent-up feelings and resentment that had been building over 50 years let loose, with Walter White being the progenitor and Heisenberg being the end result, but with no separation between them at heart. And unfortunately for all of those around him, he was also the perfect storm to derail absolutely everything he held dear. Many thanks for watching.